Well, should human beings play God? Well, that's a question frequently raised in discussions of genetics. We are sometimes invited to play God, and we are sometimes warned against it. But before we decide whether to accept the invitation or to heed the warning, it would be good to know what it means to play God. When my daughter Kate was very young, she once invited the rest of the family to play 52 semi. She was holding a deck of cards in her hand, obviously eager to play, but when we asked for an explanation of the game, she would give none, only repeating her invitation to play 52 semi. And finally we said, okay, Kate, let's play 52 semi. So she throws the cards up in the air and lets them fall to the ground, and then commanded triumphantly, now pick them up. She had gotten her trucks mixed up, confusing 52 semi with 52 pickup. But suddenly and too late, we knew what she meant. Should human beings play God? Well, it depends, you see, on what it means to play God. This morning I invite you to consider this phrase, playing God, and I hope to show that the phrase means different things to different people, and that it's used not so much to state a principle as to invoke a perspective, and different perspectives by different people. I will examine the report of the President's Commission on Genetics in 1982 called Splicing Life, and the lament of some religious people about other people playing God, and the invitation of Joseph Fletcher, come let us play God, he said, and the warnings of Paul Ramsey. And I hope to indicate along the way that we must be attentive not only to particular moral problems raised by genetic knowledge and power, but also to the perspective from which we examine and evaluate those powers. In the end, I will invite people to play God, but in the context of a perspective in which God is taken seriously and play is taken playfully. The President's Commission on Splicing Life is a good place to begin. The Commission noted the concerns about playing God. It decided that the phrase playing God does not have, quote, a specific religious meaning. Now, if the Commission had meant by that only that it meant different things to different people, then one could hardly object. But the Commission proceeded to assert that at its heart, the phrase was, quote, an expression of a sense of awe in response to extraordinary human powers and concern about the possible consequences of those vast new powers. It simply translated the warning against playing God into a concern about the consequences of exercising human powers. The Commission reduced the meaning of the phrase to secular terms and made God in the phrase superfluous. At its heart, according to the Commission, the phrase playing God has nothing to do with God. Moreover, there's nothing very playful about the phrase playing God either. The human powers in genetics and their possible consequences are too serious for playfulness. Playing God might mean what the Commission interpreted it to mean, something like, wow, human powers are awesome, let's not play around. Now, it evidently does mean something very close to that for many who use the phrase. And that interpretation of the phrase is hardly trivial, even if it isn't very helpful to guide or to limit human powers. But it's worth asking, I think, whether there is in the President's Commission a perspective which helped them to interpret the phrase the way that they did. And I think the answer is yes, and that the perspective invoked was the Baconian perspective. The President's Commission highlighted one very important feature of contemporary culture, the hegemony of scientific knowledge. Since the Enlightenment, it said, quote, Western societies have exalted the search for greater knowledge. Scientific knowledge, beginning with Copernicus, has both, quote, dethroned human beings as the unique center of the world and delivered vast powers for action into their hands. Science has taught us the hard lesson that human beings and their earth are not the center of the universe, but it is now putting into human hands powers and responsibilities to make decisions which we formerly left to God. This is, to borrow the phrase of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, humanity's coming of age. And where this is the context for talk of playing God, it's not surprising that God is superfluous when we try to make sense of the phrase. Bonhoeffer, after all, had described humanity's coming of age as an effort to think the world as though God were not a given. Science has no need of God as a working hypothesis. Indeed, it's not permitted as science to make use of God. There are assumptions operative in this perspective, however, not only about God, but also about humanity and knowledge and nature as well. With respect to humanity, science has taught us that we are not the center of the universe. However, science has not taught us where we do belong. As Nietzsche aptly put it, quote, since Copernicus, man has been rolling from the center into X. Once human beings and their earth were at the center. They did not put themselves there. God put them there, and it was simply accepted as a matter of course that they were there. But after Copernicus has shown that they are not there, not at the center, then humanity was left to fend for itself, or to keep on rolling. This positionlessness was the new assumption about humanity. And it entailed that humanity had to attempt to secure, if somewhat anxiously, a place for itself. And what better place than at the center? After Copernicus, humanity had to put itself in the center, make itself into the center. The very science, moreover, that destroyed the illusion that humanity was at the center gave to humanity power in the world and over the world. Such mastery, however, has not eliminated human insecurity and anxiety. In fact, the new powers and their unintended consequences evoke new anxieties. In this context, playing God might well be interpreted as, quote, an expression of a sense of awe before human powers and concern about unanticipated consequences. There are assumptions in the Baconian perspective concerning knowledge, too. The comment of the President's Commission that, quote, since the Enlightenment, Western societies have exalted the search for greater knowledge requires a gloss, after all. They have exalted a particular kind of knowledge, the kind of knowledge for which they reserve the honorific term science. It's simply not the case that the search for knowledge only began to be exalted with the Enlightenment. Thomas Aquinas, for example, had exalted the search for knowledge long before the Enlightenment, affirming all knowledge as good. He distinguished, however, practical from speculative or theoretical sciences. The difference was that the practical sciences were for the sake of some work to be done, while the speculative sciences were for their own sake. That classical account, that classical celebration of knowledge must be contrasted with the perspective of knowledge in Francis Bacon and exalted in Western societies. In Bacon, all knowledge is sought for its utility, quote, for the knowledge and for the benefit and use of life. The knowledge to be sought is, quote, no mere felicity of speculation, which is but the boyhood of knowledge and barren of works. The knowledge to be sought is the practical knowledge that will make humanity, quote, capable of overcoming the difficulties and the obscurities of nature, able to subdue and overcome its vexations and miseries. The knowledge exalted in Western societies is the power over nature which presumably brings human well-being in its train. In the classical account, Theory provided the wisdom to use the practical sciences appropriately. The modern account may admit, as Bacon did, that for knowledge to be beneficial, humanity must perfect and govern it in charity. But science is not self-sufficiently the source of that human quality which makes it beneficial. Moreover, the compassion or the charity that responds viscerally to the vexations and miseries of humanity will urge us to do something to relieve those miseries, but it will not tell us what thing is appropriate to do. Bacon's account of knowledge simply arms compassion with artifice and not with wisdom. For the charity to perfect and govern human powers and for the wisdom to guide charity, science must call upon something else. But upon what? And how can science have knowledge of it? Knowledge of that which transcends use has no place in Bacon's theory. Knowledge of that which might guide and limit the use of the human powers was the subject of classical theory, but not of the Enlightenment's quest for greater knowledge. In this context, there is no place for either play, because play is not useful, or for God, because God is transcendent and will not be used. And with the different assumptions concerning knowledge come different assumptions concerning nature, too. Because the Baconian project sets humanity not only over nature, but against it. The natural order and the natural processes have no dignity of their own. Their value is reduced to their utility to humanity. And nature does not serve humanity naturally. In Bacon's perspective, nature threatens to rule and to ruin humanity. The fault that runs through our world and through our lives is, according to Bacon, finally to be located in nature. Nature may be and must be mastered from the Baconian perspective. Now, this is, I think, the perspective invoked by the President's Commission, and it is from this perspective that it understands playing God as having nothing to do with either play or with God, but as having rather to do with the human scientific knowledge and power over nature, even when, or especially when, the faith that human well-being will come in its train is a creed ripe for doubt. Now, religious people have sometimes celebrated this Baconian perspective and its quest for scientific knowledge and technical power, and they have sometimes lamented it. And some who have lamented it have raised their voices in protest against almost every new scientific hypothesis and against almost all technological developments. For example, anesthesia during childbirth or vaccinations. And these evidently regard scientific inquiry as a threat to faith in God and technological innovation as an offense to God. They lament a humanity come of age and long to go back to a former time, a time of our childhood, if only we could find the way. They regret a world where God is not a given and wish to preserve the necessity of God in human ignorance and powerlessness. But such a God can only ever be a God of the gaps and can only ever be in retreat to the margins. It is an old and unhappy story in Christian apologetics that located God's presence and power where human knowledge and strength have reached their temporary limit. Newton, for example, saw certain irregularities in the motions of the planets, movements which he could not explain by his theory of gravity, and in those irregularities he saw, he said, the direct intervention of God. And when later astronomers and physicists provided a natural explanation for what had puzzled Newton, God was no longer necessary. In the context of such a piety, a defensive faith in the God of the gaps, playing God means to encroach on those areas of human life where human beings have been ignorant or powerless, for there God rules, and there only God has the authority to act. In this context, playing God means to seize God's place at the boundaries of human knowledge and power. It means to usurp God's authority and dominion there. In this context, it's understandable that humanity should be warned by some, "Thou shalt not play God." Once again, the phrase is used not so much to state a principle as to invoke this perspective. And to be sure, such warnings serve to remind humanity of its fallibility and its finitude, and such warnings are good. But there are, however, at least three problems with this perspective and with such warnings against playing God. The first and fundamental problem with this perspective is that the God of the gaps is not the God who is made known in Scripture and in creation. The God of Scripture and creation made and sustains the order that we observe and rely on. And to describe that order in terms of scientific understandings does not explain God away. It's to give an account of the way God orders God's world. The order of the world comes to us no less from the gracious hand of God than those extraordinary events that humans call miracles. Nature is no less the work of God than grace. And to understand the earth and its order as God's is not to understand it in a way that prohibits natural scientific explanations. It's to be called to serve God's cause and to be responsible to God in the midst of it. The second problem with this perspective and with such warnings against playing God is that they are indiscriminate. They do not permit discriminating judgments. There are some things which we already know how to do that we ought never do. And there are some things, including some things in genetics, which we cannot yet do, but which we must make an effort to learn to do if God is God and if we are called to follow one who heals the sick and feeds the hungry. The warnings against playing God in this perspective reduce to the slogan, "It's not nice to fool with Mother Nature," at least not any more than we're currently comfortable with. Ironically, then, the warning enthrones nature as God rather than the one who transcends it and our knowledge of it. But the third problem is a corollary of these others. By its failure to make discriminating judgments and by its confusion of God with natural process, this perspective nurtures irresponsibility. It does not take all our human powers to be part of our human responsibility to God, part of our answerability to serve God's cause in the midst of the world. It's little wonder, then, that some religious people have reacted against this God of the gaps and against this warning, "Thou shalt not play God." These have celebrated the advances of science and the innovations of technology, urging humanity bravely to go forward and issuing a priestly benediction over the Baconian project. These sometimes also use the phrase "playing God," but usually to invite humanity to play God. Joseph Fletcher, for example, responded provocatively to the charge that his enthusiasm for genetic technology amounted to a license to play God by admitting the charge and by making the invitation explicit. "Come, let us play God," he said. For Fletcher, that old God, the God of the gaps, is dead. Dead also are the taboos, he said, which prohibited trespass on the territory of that God's rule, and the fatalism that passively accepted the will of that God, and the obsolete theodicy that attempted to defend that new God. What we need, he said, is a new God. But Fletcher's new God bore a striking resemblance to the God of the 18th century deist, and indifference to a God so conceived is inevitable. Life may proceed, and playing God may proceed as though God were not a given. Now, although Fletcher said little more about this new God, he did say that any God worth believing in wills the best possible well-being for human creatures. So Fletcher's new God turns out to be a heavenly utilitarian, and this God, too, humanity must play. Fletcher's invitation to play God comes to this, that humanity should use its new powers to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number of people, not intimidated by taboos, and to take control over nature, not innervated by fatalism, to take responsibility, to design and to make a new and better world, to substitute for an absent God. It was easier in the old days, Fletcher said, quote, to attribute at least some of what happened to God's will. We could say with a moral shrug that we weren't responsible. Now we have to shoulder it all. The moral tab is ours, and we have to pick it up. The excuses of ignorance and helplessness are growing thin. But notice what has happened to responsibility here. Fletcher underscores human responsibility, and we may welcome that. But we are responsible here not so much to God as instead of God. And that shift puts an enormous and a messianic burden on genetics, a burden which, of course, leaves little time for play. The phrase playing God here does state a principle, namely utility, but it also invokes a perspective in which God is superfluous, in which humanity is maker and designer, in which knowledge is power, and in which nature must be mastered to maximize human well-being. Fletcher's perspective is Bacon's perspective. Now, Christians may welcome Fletcher's burial of the God of the gaps, but they still wait and watch and pray, not for the invention of some new God, but for the appearance of the one God who continues to create and preserve and redeem humanity and the earth. Moreover, Fletcher's invitation to play God need not seem blasphemous to those trained to imitate God or to follow God or to be disciples of one who made God present among us. But to map the path of discipleship and imitation as the utilitarian way must seem strange to those who know the law and the prophets and the Gospels and the Gospel. It seemed strange, at least to Paul Ramsey. In Ramsey's usage, although we are usually warned against playing God, we are sometimes encouraged to play God in the correct way, or to play God as God plays God. And God is no utilitarian. God, Ramsey said, quote, is not a rationalist whose care is a function of indicators of our personhood or of our achievement within those capacities. He makes his rain to fall upon the just and the unjust alike, and his sun to rise on the abnormal as well as the normal. Indeed, he has special care for the weak and the vulnerable among us. He cares according to need and not capacity or merit. And those divine patterns or images are, according to Ramsey, at the foundation of Western medical care. One might expect Ramsey then simply to echo Fletcher's invitation to play God while engaging him in conversation concerning who this God is that we are invited to play. I need to at least admit here that he more frequently warns against playing God than makes the invitation. But in the interest of time, I'm going to turn to the last part of my remarks about Ramsey. Well, permit me simply to focus on the invitation to play God, and first underscore the invitation to play. Many have complained that playing God is serious stuff, and have regretted the implication of playfulness in the phrase. Some play, however, can be very serious indeed, as anybody who plays noon-hour basketball surely knows. Playfulness is quite capable of being serious, but it's not capable of being purely instrumental. When Teilhard de Chardin said that in the great game that is being played, we are the players as well as the stakes, in this notion of stakes, he created a powerful impression, a powerful image to call attention both to the extraordinary powers of human beings and to the awesome consequences of exercising those powers. There's no wonder playfulness seems inappropriate. The stakes are so high. But precisely because the stakes are so high, it may be apt to set alongside de Chardin's image a Dutch proverb. It's not the marbles that matter, but the game. When the stakes are high, or even when the stakes alone are taken seriously, then one is tempted to cheat in order to win. And when one cheats, then one only pretends to play. The cheat plays neither fair nor seriously. Play, even marbles, can be serious, but it cannot be purely instrumental. And it cannot allow attention to be monopolized by the stakes, by the consequences of winning or losing. When our attention is riveted by de Chardin's image that we are the stakes, it may be well to be reminded that we are the players, too. Then we may be able to avoid reducing the moral life to a concern about consequences, even when the stakes are high. We may be able to avoid reducing ourselves to makers and designers, or our existence to joyless and incessant work. We may see that we are at stake, not just in the sense of some plastic destiny that our powers may make, but already in the imagination, in the image of ourselves with which human creativity begins. The invitation to play God is more specifically an invitation to play God, and that invitation requires attention to the God that we are invited to play. In a foreword to a book entitled Should Doctors Play God, Mrs. Billy Graham wrote some time ago, "If I were an actress who was going to play, let's say, Joan of Arc, I would learn all there is to learn about Joan of Arc. If I were a doctor or anyone else trying to play God, I would learn all I could about God." That seems a prudent strategy for an actress and good advice for people called to imitate God. The invitation to play God, to cast ourselves playfully in the role of God, invites theological reflection. It invites reflection about God. So permit me then to simply suggest a few images of God in the Jewish and Christian tradition and to suggest something of their relevance to playing God in genetics. Two of these images are regularly invoked in the discussions, creator and healer, and the third is often overlooked. It is that God is one who takes the side of the poor. First, then, what would it mean to playfully cast ourselves in the role of the Creator? This, of course, has been the topic of much discussion, but if I read the story aright, to cast ourselves in the role of the Creator might mean something too much overlooked. It might mean that we look at the creation and at its genetics and say to ourselves, God, that's good. It might mean, that is, first of all, just to wonder, to stand in awe, to delight in the elegant structure of our universe and its DNA. It would mean a celebration of a knowledge which was not simply mastery. It would mean an appreciation of nature and of human nature as given, rather than a suspicion of it as threatening and requiring human mastery. If I read the story right, it might mean a second thing also. It might mean to take a day off, to rest, to play. But we have already talked of that. It also means, of course, a third thing, a thing seldom overlooked in these discussions, that human creativity is given with the creation. Human beings are created and called to exercise dominion in the world, and I see no reason to suppose that such creativity and control does not extend to genetics. It's not Mother Nature, after all, who is God in the Christian story. Human creativity and control, however, are to be exercised in response to God, in imitation of God's ways, and in service to God's cause. That's a part of the Christian story, too. A part of the story usually captured in describing ourselves as stewards, and our responsibility as stewardship. We can discover something of God's cause, the cause stewards serve, in a second feature of the story. God is the healer. Jesus, the one in whom God and the cause of God were made known, was a healer. We discover there that the cause of God is life, not death, and the cause of God is human flourishing, including the human flourishing that we call health, and not disease. What does it mean to cast ourselves playfully in the role of God the healer? It means to intend life in its flourishing, not death or human suffering. And therefore, genetic therapy, like other therapeutic interventions which aim at health, may be celebrated. Healing is playing God the way God plays God. Genetic therapies, however, are still mostly, even if not completely, a distant hope. The more immediate contributions of genetics to medicine are in genetic diagnoses. And where there are therapeutic options given a diagnosis, then these too may be celebrated. However, genetic diagnoses without therapeutic options are sometimes deeply ambiguous. Prenatal diagnoses, for example, are frequently ambiguous. Already we can diagnose a number of genetic conditions in a fetus, and the number is constantly growing. And for most of these, there is no therapy. The tests allow the parents to make a decision about whether to give birth or to abort. How shall we play God here in ways responsible to God? If God's cause is life rather than death, then those who would play God in imitation of God would not be disposed to abort. They will not celebrate abortion as a therapeutic option. When some children with Down syndrome are aborted because they have Downs, there seems a reasonable possibility that prenatal diagnosis has been and will be used irresponsibly. And when some girls are aborted because they are girls, then it seems obvious that the tests have been used irresponsibly. When the slogan about preventing birth defects is taken to justify preventing the birth of defectives, then those who do not measure up to the standards or match the preferences of parents, then there are reasons to worry a little, to worry that the disposition of a good parent will change from the sort of uncalculating nurturance that can evoke and sustain trust from children to the sort of calculating nurturance that's prepared to abandon or abort the offspring who do not match specifications. Playing God the way God plays God, or if you will, the way God plays parent, with sustained care for the weak and the helpless, and for the little ones who do not measure up. Consider finally this third image. God is one who takes the side of the poor. What would it mean to cast ourselves in the role of one who takes the side of the poor? It would mean, I think, at the very least, a concern for social justice here. It would mean, for example, to ask about the allocation of resources to the Human Genome Project. When cities are crumbling and schools are deteriorating, when we complain about not having sufficient resources to help the poor or the homeless, when we do not have the resources to care for all the ill, is this a just and fair use of our society's resources? Is it an allocation of social resources that can claim to imitate God's care and concern for the poor? And having raised that question, let me focus instead on the sharing of the burdens and benefits of the Human Genome Project itself. Who bears the burdens, and who will benefit? And is this distribution fair? Does it fit the story of one who takes the side of the poor and the powerless? If we cast ourselves in this role, if we attempt to mirror God's justice and care for the poor and the powerless, we will not, I think, create human life in order to learn from it with the intention of destroying it after we have learned what we can from it. We will not use the unborn for experiments to learn some things that would benefit others, even if it were a great benefit, even if it would benefit a great number of others. And we will be cautious about stigmatizing some as diseased and others as carriers. But consider also the sharing of the benefits. Who stands to benefit from the Human Genome Project? Will genetic powers be marketed? presumably given the patenting of microorganisms. And so the rich may get richer while the poor still watch and pray. Will the poor have access to health care benefits that their taxes help to develop? Since health care reform died in Congress again, can any of us have any confidence that genetic technology will be available to the uninsured or to those with public insurance? Or will insurance companies use genetic information to screen candidates for insurance? Will the category of a pre-existing condition be redefined to make it easier for insurance companies to make still larger profit? And will corporations use genetic information to screen applicants? Well, they have. The point of these questions is not simply to lament our failure to accomplish health care reform. It's to suggest that playing God as God plays God will be attentive not only to the intriguing questions at the frontiers of science and technology, but it will also be attentive to much more mundane questions about fairness and about the effect of such innovations on the poor. If we are to play God as God plays God, then we have a pattern for imitation in God's hospitality to the poor and to the stranger, to the powerless and to the voiceless, to one who is different from both us and from the norm, including some genetic norm. If we are to play God as God plays God, then we will work for a society where human beings, each of them, even the least of them, are treated as worthy of God's care and affection. Now, this has been just a selection of images of God, and I admit that the moves to claims about genetic interventions were made much too quickly. But enough has been said, I hope, to suggest the importance of the perspective in terms of which we think genetics, and in terms of which we make sense, not only of our powers, but of the phrase, playing God. I urge you in stewardship and in service to resist the power of the Baconian perspective in our culture and in the academy. And I urge you in stewardship and in service to resist the temptation to worship some God of the gaps instead of the God of creation and redemption. I urge you in faith not to pretend to substitute for an absent God. I urge you in faithfulness to respond with all of your powers and with all human powers to the cause of God made known in Christ. I urge you to play God as God plays God. God is God and not us. But God has called us to follow where God leads, to imitate God's work, to serve God's cause. Thank you.